Hello guys, welcome to the fiction series. Today we are gonna see, what if Naruto was the demon prince of Konoha and got harem? Part 1. If you want more awesome fan fiction like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, so without wasting any time let's get into the video. Prologue. Konoha, also known the Hidden Leaf Village, is the most powerful and well-respected village known to ninjas. A village that is prosperous and teeming with life, even as children are put to bed and men make their way to the local taverns to drink themselves silly. The sun was inching its way down to the horizon, setting and dyeing the sky bright orange. It is forbidden for any of the civilians to go into the forest surrounding the village walls without permission or escort, for it is rumored that a terrible demon lives within those woods. Most children heed the warnings and frightening stories that their parents tell them about the demon and the forest, but, naturally, some are skeptical. The small boy allowed himself to be fussed over as he was tucked into bed, his dark eyes, not on his mother, but on the darkening sky outside his window. The woman kissed his forehead and moved to turn off the lamp by his bedside. "Mom?" She paused, easing back onto the bed. "Yes, sweetheart." He looked at her out of the corner of his eye, still facing the window. "Is the demon prince really real?" Her eyes widened slightly in surprise before hardening. "What makes you ask that all of a sudden?" He bit the inside of his cheek and looked back out the window. It wasn't sudden, not really, it had been on his mind for a good few days now, ever since he and his friends had thrown their ball too high and lost it over the village's protective walls. They had attempted to retrieve it, only to be stopped short by the military forces that kept Konoha safe. Shinobi. Ninja. They had been scolded quite roughly before being sent back to their school. He shrugged as nonchalantly as a child could. "No reason, I guess." His mother's stature visibly softened. "Well," she began, shifting her position so that her body was parallel to her son's, "some people will tell you otherwise, but yes, the demon prince is real. There is some controversy about the prince's intent, a few people think he protects the village, but in truth it is a vile, powerful demon that takes the form of a boy. That's why we civilians are not allowed to leave Konoha without a shinobi escort, were it not for the ninja to protect us, it would gobble us up as soon as we are outside of the gates." She gave her child a piercing stare. "That is why you must never ever try to sneak out." He rolled his eyes to hide his nervousness. "Like I would ever try to do that." Indeed, he wouldn't be attempting such a thing again. Ninja were scarier than his mother, and she was a terrifying woman when angered. "What kind of demon is it, Mom?" She laughed sharply, and it was not a happy sound. "What kind of demon?" "Silly, a demon is a demon." "Really now," she firmly pushed him down onto his pillows. The boy did not dare protest, stop thinking about such terrible things and go to sleep. She kissed his forehead again, turned off the light, and left him to his dreams. But he did not attempt to fall asleep, the mysterious demon prince of Konoha still sharp and bitter on his mind. Bedtime story though it was, he wasn't satisfied with a fairy tale and pondered upon what the story might have stemmed from. Did not all rumors start out as truths? "Ampu." He bolted upright in his bed at the loud noise, stiff with shock. "Ampu." He jerked his head toward the window, catching a brief flash of red before the color vanished. Throwing the covers off his legs, he crept over to the portal and slid the glass open. "Hom." The bright red ball he and his friends had lost over the wall the other day bounced up onto the windowsill and right into his surprised arms. He blinked dumbly for several seconds before peering down the side of his house. A blond boy stood on the street, grinning and waving happily at him. Stunned, he hesitantly lifted a hand in return. "Your ball is really fun. Try not to lose it in my forest again, though, okay?" The strange boy didn't give him a chance to respond and was already dashing away down the street. The boy rubbed at his eyes in astonishment, trying to decide if he had just seen a tail coming out of the other kid's pants or if he was just stuck in a dream and had imagined the whole thing. However, the other boy has gone too quickly for him to gain a second glance and he looked down instead at the shiny red ball in his hands. A single stem of foxtail grass was stuck to the side, almost like a crude calling card. He smiled timidly, as if he has just discovered some big, amazing secret, dark eyes glittering. His mother was definitely wrong about the demon prince. It was with that rebellious thought in mind that he crawled back into bed, clutching the toy tightly against his chest, and fell into the clutches of slumber. And prologue. The day was humid and cool as several figures walked through the lush forest surrounding Konoha. Unlike the Konoha Chuunin leading the way, a tanned man with a scar over his nose, the other four ninja were from Sunagaker, the village hidden in the sand. This Suna group consisted of a single genin shinobi team. Their Jounin sensei was an intimidating-looking man who wore a drapery of cloth over one half of his face, covering what could only assumedly be horrific battle scars. The second ninja was, like the other two, a genin and was the middle sibling of the three at 16 years of age. He was clad almost completely in a traditional puppeteer's garb, modified for the needs of a shinobi. An unidentifiable, hairy, bandage-wrapped object hung from his shoulders, and his face was lined with purple kabuki paint. Behind the puppeteer walked his younger brother, a 15-year-old with blood-red hair. His eyes, a pale sea green, seemed blank, but concealed within the insomniatic rings that surrounded them, smoldered a sharp edge of insanity and a suppressed lust for blood and death. On the unusually pale boy's forehead stood the symbol for love, red and mocking. The young man's form was almost overtaken by the enormous gourd he carried on his back. The third and oldest sibling was an 18-year-old young woman with a fan strapped to the red sash encircling her waist. Unusually, her wheat gold hair is pulled back into 4 severe bunches instead of the traditional 2 ponytails. She picked idly at her light-colored shirt, finding the forest weather a little too cool for her tastes, as her brilliant turquoise eyes darted around. Though she didn't say anything, she honestly would have preferred to be going anywhere but Konoha at that particular moment. After so many years striving for peace, they were being ordered to infiltrate Konoha during the Chuunin exams with a sound and attack Konoha, starting another war. She didn't like it one bit. Silently, she cursed her egotistical maniac of a father, the Kazekage, for every unfortunate happening in her siblings and her lives. It was her father's fault that their mother was dead, it was their father's fault that they were putting their lives on the line to start a war, and most importantly, it was their father's fault that her youngest brother, Gaara, was a bloodthirsty killer with a demon raccoon dog, the Shukaku, sealed inside him. "Hey, Temari, you okay back there?" came her first brother's voice, snapping her out of her reverie. She looked over into his painted face. "What? You were looking kind of pissed off." "Oh." She waved it off. "It's nothing, I was just thinking." "You think?" Kankuro asked, feigning shock. Temari rolled her eyes. He must have been pretty bored to make that remark. "Shut the hell up. I could say the same thing about you." The black-clad genin snickered to himself and went back to being quiet. Temari resisted the urge to frown, she wasn't exactly entertained herself by the scenery, however bafflingly green it was, and silently wished that Kankuro had responded to her playful retort. Suddenly she paused, her eyes drifted to the shrubbery along the side of the road, and she almost shrieked when she unexpectedly caught sight of a pair of brilliant blue eyes staring at her from within the shadows. They only stared at her for a moment though, before blinking out of existence, and she was left wondering if she had even seen them at all. "Is there something wrong, miss?" the Konoha escort asked. Temari hadn't even realized that she had stopped in her tracks. "No, sorry," she said, frowning a little. "I just thought I saw something, that's all." She waved it off and they continued walking. The Chuunin was now looking at her with curious eyes. "If I may ask, what was it that you saw?" he asked. Temari fought off the urge to raise an eyebrow, wondering why the man suddenly seemed so interested. "I thought I saw a pair of eyes watching us." The man looked surprised for a moment, then broke out in a full grin. "Really? You did? You should consider yourself very lucky, miss, I believe you may have caught a glimpse of Konoha's demon prince." "Demon? Prince?" Kankuro echoed incredulously. The Chuunin nodded. "Yes. There is a legend within our village of a Jinchuriki that lives within this very forest," he explained. Temari chanced to glance at her redheaded youngest brother. As a child, the demon container was shunned and hated by the villagers, but he never knew the reason why. Despite his isolation, they say that the boy always tried to be cheerful and kind to earn the respect of the villagers. Sadly, that never happened, as the boy was the container for not any demon, but the most powerful and hated demon in existence. Eventually, the boy was run out of the village, the people screaming curses and throwing weapons as he ran, sobbing. Some people like to believe that the boy died out in the wilderness, but most people say that the demon he hosted took pity on the boy and trained him, soon making the Jinchuriki into his heir, the prince of demons. The boy is said to still live within these forests, but the reason why is unclear. Some say that he is plotting the downfall of Konoha to get revenge for what was done to him during his childhood, but there are others that believe that he protects us, still trying to prove that he's not a monster. "How interesting," Temari commented. "The Lord of Demons. That's impossible, it was killed 15 years ago." Baki grumbled, crossing his arms. The Chuunin shrugged. "What do you believe?" Temari asked, intrigued. "Me? Well, I like to think that he protects the village, but it's hard to see that being true. Wishful thinking, really." Kankuro was frowning. "Okay, I don't believe a word of this, but let's say that this guy is real. What would he be doing watching us?" The man looked back at him. "Just observing you, making you aren't a threat to him or anything of that nature. Be careful about the foxes around here, though. There are a lot of them and he doesn't take kindly to anyone who harms them. I'm actually rather surprised it was he you saw and not one of his foxes. Very, very few people have ever caught a glimpse of him." Kankuro held back the flinch when the Chuunin mentioned threats. "Is that so? Do you know how many?" Temari asked. Kankuro groaned and rolled his eyes. The blonde ignored him. Her thirst for knowledge, even about things that were useless to her lifestyle, was no big secret. "How many?" the man repeated, pondering. "As I said, not many. Fewer than you can count on both hands would be my guess, but I cannot say for sure." "So few?" the Kunoichi noted, surprised. He nodded. "The only person alive to have actually had true contact with him is our Hokage. Anyone else is long dead for one reason or another." He gave her a nervous glance. "There is a rumor that those who look upon him are cursed and die shortly after viewing his face." "Is he a fox demon or a basilisk?" Temari said jokingly. Nevertheless, their escort continued to look at her as if he expected her to drop dead any moment. Bright blue eyes watched as the newcomers presented their official papers and gained access to the Hidden Leaf Village. Only one team of many, but they were the only group so far that had held a conversation about the living myth that lived in the woods. The legend that the Chuunin escort had relayed was somewhat accurate, but certainly not right on the dot, though that could be accounted for the shortened version of the fairy tale. Really, protect this village? His eyes narrowed in amusement. That red-haired boy was something to ponder, however, and was the reason they had caught his attention in the first place. That bloodlust that surrounded him and his chakra signature was a clear indication that he had to be a host for the Shukaku if his nationality was anything to go by. Raising a clawed hand, he beckoned one of his foxes. He sent the kid off with instructions to keep an eye on the foreigners. She yipped in response and dashed toward the village walls. The owner of the blue eyes stared after his comrade. Something big was going to happen soon. He could feel it in his fur. Konoha appeared, by all means, a wealthy, prosperous, and beautiful village. Unlike Sunagakure, which was almost completely military-based, Konoha had as many civilians as shinobi, if not more. Already Temari was forming a map in her head, her eyes steely and alert. Their Jounin sensei, Baki, had left them at their temporary apartment to get in touch with the Itagakure spy they were allied with. He had given them strict orders to stay in their rooms, however, Baki knew as well as she did that Gaara wasn't about to heed the older man's orders. So Temari hadn't wasted any time either in escaping and scouting out the village that was to be their home for the next 2 months. And Kuro had attempted fiercely to berate her for leaving, but it was not as if he understood. He was at his most content when working on his puppets and experimenting with poisons, but Temari was of a more restless nature, and her love of botany urged her to seek out the unusual plant life that Konoha harbored. The sun was unusually light on her shoulders, and any breeze that drifted through her hair was cool and clear, a foreign sensation. The native shinobi she had come across so far did not seem to be much of a threat in her eyes, and though there was a pair that nearly frightened her out of her skin with shouts of joy and youth, she knew better than to underestimate these forest-dwelling fighters. Konoha was known for having the fewest border guards as well the fewest successful infiltrators. The village did not get a fearsome reputation like that without something solid backing up the rumor. She was examining the structure of the west gates when that thought floated to the forefront of her mind, and she paused. The tale that the scarred Chuunin had told her was pulled out of her memory, and she pondered upon the 2 pieces of information. It was a child's fairy tale, something mothers told their troublemaking youngsters to keep them out of danger, but if the demon prince of Konoha were a true tale, then it would seamlessly explain Konohagakure's unusual defense system. She thought upon the mythological prince, perhaps once a child not too unlike Gaara, chased into exile. Containing a monster such as the Kyuubi, much more powerful than Shukaku, the boy would have no doubt caved into the tailed beast's insane mumbles and given in to the monster. She imagined a twisted fox of flame and charcoal, something like Shukaku's smaller form only more hideous and malicious. She shuddered at the very idea and rubbed her biceps to ward off the chill in her blood. It did not bode well to think of such a demon. But, she thought, looking down the dirt road and into the seemingly infinite forest, it was something that needed to be looked into. No one planning the invasion had ever considered an enemy demon coming into the equation. Gaara himself was a very territorial being, no one crossed the desert without being observed by his never-sleeping eyes, and he housed only the weakest of Biju. If the demon prince of Konoha truly did exist, how territorial could he prove to be, especially if threatened? She couldn't leave the theory unexplored, and when the guards had their eyes averted, she darted out of the village and into the foliage. Colorful birds chirped and flitted between trees both massive and spindly. Insects clicked and scuttled into burrows hidden within tree roots and decaying logs. The forest was lacking any brittle twigs to crack with a footstep, everything was very wet and very, very green. The forest floor was a carpet of moss and rotting foliage, what few twigs that there were simply bent and did not break with any sort of resounding crack that might alert the native ninja. She glanced up. There was no sky to be seen, the light that filtered down was emerald green and otherworldly to her eyes. What little sound she made seemed muted. Not muted enough, she thought, feeling a gaze settle on her. Her hackles rose, and she placed her hand on her fan, taking what she hoped was an obviously defensive position. Her 5 senses went on high alert, and she called out in a firm tone. I don't mean anyone any harm. The stare didn't lessen, if anything, she felt as if even more eyes were locked onto her form. What on earth are you all doing? Panic bloomed within Temari's breast, which she quickly stomped down. The owner of the voice was most likely a Konoha shinobi, and she wasted no time in running off as soon as the hidden eyes diverted their attention. Her blood was pounding in her ears, she could be jeopardizing the entire mission. She felt a fool for not taking the risks of getting caught into consideration when she had the chance. She could not let herself get caught. The trees came to an abrupt and unexpected stop and she stumbled into an open field. The sky opened up above Temari's head like a gaping toothless grin, and a sea of white flowers filled the expanse before her. Turquoise eyes widened in awe. What is this? She murmured to herself. Dragonflies and butterflies flitted about in the air, sipping nectar, mating, and basking in the sun. The atmosphere was rich with the sweet scent of the flowers, a smell that was almost too sweet. It made her nostrils burn slightly and made her eyes itch. Despite being almost all white, she noticed that the flowers were marred by a variety of colors. Black, yellow, violet, cyan, blue, pink, red, there were no dead or sickly flowers anywhere within sight. All was bright and alive. What do you think you're doing here? She whipped around, her movement more precise than that of a ballerina, hand arsing to grasp her battle fan. At her movement, the owner of the voice also took up a defensive stance, his center of gravity low and hands held close to the torso like wound-up springs. It was a man. Tall and dressed more like nobility than a shinobi. His hair was a finer shade of gold than hers and lightly covered oddly pointed ears. He would have been handsome if not for the thin, black lines that marred his high cheekbones. For a moment, she nearly relaxed, but his forget-me-not blue eyes glistened and she felt herself choking on her own terror. Demon. He obviously hadn't verified her as a threat yet, which she was thankful for as already she felt she was in more danger than Gaara could daydream of. Those eyes were unnatural, inhuman, and with this new awareness she took in his clawed fingers, the glimpse of white fang protruding over his lip and the bushels of tail curling about his ankles. He didn't clear his throat or make any sound at all, but there was a shift in the atmosphere and Temari realized he was waiting for a response. Her mouth was filling with saliva, but she couldn't swallow. Her palms were only beginning to feel damp, though sweat already trickled down the sides of her face. The muscles in her legs were tight, ready to spring away at a moment's notice. She licked her lips slowly. Just verifying a theory. The corner of his mouth crinkled upward. And did you find what you were looking for? Her voice failed her and she only nodded stiffly. Then leave. Temari didn't hesitate, jumping back into the trees and fleeing as fast as her legs would carry her. More than once, she nearly stumbled over her own feet, adrenaline keeping her heart pounding in her ears. She was paranoid that he was chasing her, but each time she glanced back, the man was nowhere within her sight. Nevertheless, she could feel his eerie blue eyes burning holes into her back, as if he knew that curiosity would eventually bring her back. She could hear his thoughts on the wind and sped up fearfully. Until next time, Vixen. True to its name, Temari found Area 44, the Forest of Death, to be hauntingly creepy. On the other hand, she reflected, she probably wouldn't have been as wary if she weren't on a team with her Jinchuriki brother. He made it all the more deadly, and she was more afraid of him than any man-eating centipede or scorpion hidden in the soil. Only in the deepest recesses of her mind did Temari allow herself to admit she loved her youngest brother. Not 5 minutes into the second exam and the screams began to echo voices of a team of genin she couldn't be bothered to remember. Gaara became agitated at the noise, his bloodlust no longer suppressed. They were in no rush to reach the tower that was their goal. Gaara had been growing more and more aggressive since they left Suna, he'd been anticipating this like a child anticipating a birthday. In the words of her puppet-wielding sibling. Better them than us. Nevertheless, they had every intention of collecting the other scroll and reaching the tower long before nightfall. Spending a night camping with Gaara was something avoided at all costs, even outside the Chuunin exams. The Chuunin exams themselves were ingeniously planned. She hadn't truly known what to expect, only that she and her brothers, her team, had to make it through. Failure was not an option, their father ordered it. Their first test, a written test, was certainly unexpected, but proved to be a very effective method, though she was loath to admit she was impressed. Their current test was more predictable, more of a catch the flag sort of deal. Still, she thought, that didn't mean people were supposed to be idiots about it, and the group of Rainin trying to stare them down were certainly doing an impressive job of being idiots. The leader, an older character with part of his mouth sewn up, seemed to have the biggest ego. Kids from the sand challenging us straight on is quite foolish. Temari resisted the urge to roll her eyes. Forget big, this guy had an ego the size of a blue whale. She could feel the bloodlust rolling off Gaara in waves, though the Rainin seemed oblivious. She wondered if the man could back up his big words. Hey, kid. The Rainin continued, sparing Gaara an arrogant glance. You should be more careful in picking your opponents. You're all going to die. Gaara seemed almost amused. "Shut up, old man." "Hey Gaara." Kankuro spoke up boldly, looking at his younger sibling. "Shouldn't we follow and gather some information before we fight? If they have the same scroll as us, there's no need to fight." Temari glanced over at him. She wasn't fond of Gaara's bloodbaths either, but she could tell that he needed to kill, or he might come after them. He wasn't allowed to kill any civilians while they were in Konoha, and the Chuunin exams were his only outlet for the time being. Also, in all honesty, the more people that died, the less competition they'd have in the exams. Kankuro continued. "Unnecessary fights are. It doesn't matter." Gaara interrupted. "I'll kill everyone we encounter." The icy chill in his voice almost made Temari shiver. Yes, he really needed to kill something right now. The lead-aim ninja scowled. "Then let's do this," he said, pulling 6 umbrellas off from his back, 3 being quickly tossed into the air. "Take this, kid." Rain of Senbon. The umbrellas began spinning rapidly, creating a deadly shower of. "This strikes from all angles, there is no escape." Gaara only looked bored, and he glared at the man as his sand effortlessly blocked the barrage of needles. "Is that it?" The enemy gaped, his mouth flapping in disbelief before trying and failing again. "A rain of needles, nah." Gaara murmured. "Well then, I'll make it rain blood instead." The aimed-in gave it one more go, charging them mindlessly, and he paid for his lack of tact. He was crushed into oblivion by Gaara's sand within seconds. Temari squeezed her eyes shut and turned her head away. The 2 remaining nin shrieked, crying for their lives, but as always, her youngest brother was deaf to their pleas. The sound of crunching bones and the smatter of hot blood across the ground reached her ears, and it was only when their voices came to an abrupt end that she looked back upon the earth with gem-colored irises. "It's the scroll of heaven," Kankuro declared, grinning. "How convenient." "I'm not satisfied." Their redeeded sibling growled. Temari stiffened, swallowing thickly. This was quickly growing dangerous. Kankuro frowned. "Let's stop, Gaara." The youngest narrowed his black-rimmed eyes and fixed his elder sibling with a hard glare. "Are you afraid, coward?" Kankuro frowned more deeply and took several steps forward. He was putting his foot down on this one. "You might be okay, but it's dangerous for Temari and me. We only need 1 set of scrolls. We don't need any more. Don't bring me into this." Temari screamed mentally. She struggled to remember when the next full moon was. Gaara stretched out a hand threateningly. "Slacker. Don't order me around." Temari's eyes widened when Kankuro went so far as to grab the front of Gaara's clothing. "Cut it out. Why don't you listen to what your older brother says once in a while?" "I have never thought of you 2 as my siblings," Gaara said coldly. "If you get in my way, I'll kill you." Gaara held out his hand again, and Temari felt panic rise in her chest. "Gaara, stop. Don't be so cold. This is your big sister asking you." She pleaded. "Okay." Kankuro looked disgusted. Irideed moved his hand and sand began to gather. He moved to clench his fist. Temari panicked. "Gaara," she cried. Kankuro's eyes were clenched shut, waiting for the death blow. However, it never came. "Fine." Gaara said, placing the cork on his gourd. Temari sighed in relief and placed a hand over her rapidly beating heart. Gaara had heeded her words. She followed. Sleep was slow in coming that night. Her body was too tense, mind too wound up, full of questions about that person. She tossed and turned for what felt like ages, and even resorted to meditation in an attempt to calm her raging mind, and still sleep evaded her. She toyed with the idea of sneaking out, but quickly discarded the idea. It wasn't worth going back through the forest of death. That left her wandering the maze of halls that spider webbed through and underneath the tower. Underneath was what she currently found herself exploring. Not bothering to move along quietly, the sound of her footsteps was her chosen companion. Doors dotted the hallways, doors upon doors upon doors, and nearly all of them locked. The only one she had found unlocked so far was a janitorial supply closet, which served to be no help at all. It wasn't just a midnight stroll, Temari was seeking out information. She wondered if it was fated or just a bizarre stroke of luck that the next door she came across, already oddly open, led to a library of all things. The room's vast ceiling remained black, despite the number of burning candles piled on the few tables. Sitting at one of these tables was a tiny, very white-haired old man. Temari froze, feeling like a child caught stealing treats. However, instead of demanding to know who she was and what she was doing here, the old man merely adjusted his enormous spectacles at her. "HRRM. Another one, eh? Been a while. Can't find what you're looking for in the new library, can ya? Well then, what can I do you for, sir?" Temari looked down at her nightclothes and concluded that the old man's eyesight was something awful. A man was something she did not look like. However, scanning over the impossibly high shelves, she decided that she wasn't about to correct a pint-sized elder. Opportunity had presented itself. "What books do you have on demons, old man?" "Happenings." She felt rather dismayed. The old man was as deaf as he was blind. Demons. She persisted. No man. The man gasped suddenly. Are you telling me Konoha has been wiped out, my good man? The blonde woman rolled her eyes. Not now, but oh yes, it will be soon enough, you old mouse man. She bowed down to his level and cupped her hands around her mouth. Books. About. Demons. Now his skin color matched his hair. Demons have destroyed the village. Oh, that's terrible. Terrible. I will find you some books on those nasty critters right away. You'll be wanting to know as much as possible in order to fight back, HRRM, yes. He paused in front of a shelf of large scrolls covered in dust, as thick as shrimp tempura crust. He adjusted his glasses and looked through the scrolls. HRRM, now, let's see here demons, aha. Here it is. He reached up, dragging a green scroll out of the pile. It was either very heavy or the old man was just weak since it slipped from his grasp, falling to the floor loudly. Dust billowed up into the air. Oh dear. The man squeaked, holding his robes in front of his face. Temari coughed and placed a hand over her mouth and nose, wondering when was the last time this library was in use. It took several minutes for the dust to finally settle, leaving the old librarian to apologize and ramble profusely. Temari waved him off with a fake smile. Leaning down to pick up the yellow tome, she brushed off some of the lingering dust. She set it on the table, sat down, and began to read. Despite what Temari had been expecting, the next stage of the Chuunin exams did not go straight to finals. Too many teams had passed the forest of death, so now they were being forced to go through preliminaries. She found herself wishing that they'd let Gaara wipe out a few more teams. The first genin to face off were chosen at random, 2 Konoha shinobi, and the remaining ninja made their way to the observation platforms, leaving the Uchiha boy and some masked guy down in the arena. Temari took her place between her brothers, crossing her arms. It was an interesting match, but it was one she barely paid attention to. Her thoughts were elsewhere, and she knew pretty much all she needed to know about him and all the other Konoha genin, thanks to a spy named Kabuto. He was an ass. Both genin were dragged away by medics, though the Uchiha was declared the winner. Something strange caused markings to appear on his skin, damaging him. She didn't really care. The screen in the room flashed through more names again before stopping on Aburami Shino and Zaku from the sound. Zaku went down quickly due to injuries he received from earlier in the exams and because the Aburami guy with the creepy bugs clogged the holes in his hands. The sound genin's arms were a mess afterwards and he would probably never fight again. Once again the screen scrolled through names. Kankuro smirked and walked down into the arena with an arrogant stride. The 2 genin met in the center of the arena. Unlike my teammate, I won't go easy on you because you're a kid. Let me warn you, once my move gets a hold of you, it's over. Give up. I'll finish this match quickly. Then I'll finish the match quickly, too. Kankuro pulled the bandaged object off his shoulder. The leaf nin glared while Kankuro smirked beepily. Hajime. He declared, swinging his arm down and stepping back. The leaf nin rushed forward. I won't let you do anything. Victory goes to the swiftest. He drove his fist forward and attempted to hit Kankuro, but was effortlessly blocked. The sand nin's smirk quickly turned into an expression of shock as his opponent's limbs began to lengthen and wrapped around him. Idiot. Temari thought. He completely underestimated his opponent. The leaf nin proceeded to explain his attack. I can take my joints off their hinges and use my chakra to control my loosened body. That's why I can strangle you until your bones break. Unless you give up, I will continue strangling you. He glanced over at the wrapped weapon. I don't know what kind of tool you use, but there's no point to it if I immobilize your body like this. I can break your neck as well. Hurry and give up. Kankuro managed to smirk. Nah, I don't think so. Do you want to die? The ninja asked, tightening his grip. Idiot. You're the one who's going to die. Temari raised an eyebrow. So that's your game. Clever, little brother. Growing frustrated, the Konoha ninja's grip tightened and forced Kankuro's neck to break with a sickening crack. Gaara looked away. How stupid. Temari glanced over at her youngest sibling. She wondered what he meant by that. The leaf nin scowled. Damn it. I got carried away and broke it. But then something on the ground caught his attention. Pieces of Kankuro's face were breaking away. Kankuro's head lifted up and did a complete 180, showing a cracking, unnatural face. Now it's my turn. The puppet growled, grinning cruelly. Karasu's limbs burst out of the fake body and lashed out, wrapping around the leaf ninja in a deadly embrace, the arms squeezed, crushing the enemy nin's spine. A marionette. He realized in horror. With that, Kankuro burst out of the wrappings, his hand held out and glowing with chakra. The puppet twitched. That was the real one. He's a puppeteer. Smirking, Kankuro slowly closed his hand, causing Karasu's grip to tighten. I give the leaf ninja gasped, the air being pushed out of his lungs. Too late. Now, let's soften you up. Kankuro chuckled. His hand tightened into a fist, and with that the man's spine snapped. He and the puppet collapsed. The proctor coughed. The winner is Kankuro. With a deft movement, Karasu was wrapped in the bandages once again, and he headed back up to his team. The Konoha was carried away on a stretcher. The next match was between two very annoying girls. Fangirls apparently, seeing as their fight was all rooted in their interest in one guy. Tamari wondered how the two had survived the second third of the exam. The tournament ended in a double knockout. Finally, it came to be Tamari's turn. She smirked and entered the arena, standing across from a bun-haired girl named Tenten. Up in the stands, a freak dressed in green, presumably the girl's teammate, cheered loudly. "Do your best, Tenten," the green freak yelled. "Begin." The proctor brought his hand down as if cutting an invisible ribbon. Tamari allowed herself to smirk as the other girl leapt back quickly. "Fight, Tenten. Believe in your power, Tenten. Tenten, we're with you. Fight with everything you have. That's it. Show your spirit. Go, go." Tamari glanced up at the two green-clad ninja. Their yelling was extremely annoying. She looked back at her opponent. The girl was average at best. Average looking and average clothing. Nothing about her stood out except for the buns on her head. Her hands, however, were rather calloused for an average kunoichi. She was probably a weapons specialist from her posture and muscular structure. "What's wrong?" the proctor asked. "Please begin." Tamari watched Tenten's eyes carefully. "Heh. You want to observe what I do? This is just a warning, but if I start attacking, you're going to be finished in a second. You're not skilled enough to see how I'll attack." She placed a hand on her fan. "Stop trying to look good. I don't mind, come on." Tenten smiled at the challenge. "You sure seem confident. Then I'll go without hesitation." She leapt into the air and tossed several shuriken at the blonde kunoichi, but missed. She landed, her face shocked. "I missed. That can't be." Tamari placed her hands on her hips. Yes, the woman was a weapons specialist. That was too bad. She was hoping for at least a decent challenge. "What's wrong? Was that attack just to test me? Or did you shrink up with fear and can no longer aim? I thought that I would have more fun, but it seems that I can't expect much from you." Tenten grimaced angrily. Tamari's always an entertaining fighter to watch, eh? Kankuro smirked down at his sister. "This is pointless," Gara muttered. The blonde woman watched as Tenten counted the tiles. "She's measuring the distance between her and me. Her next attack must be a big one." Tamari reached up and grabbed her fan firmly. The brunette ran in a circle around her, judging the distance between them before leaping into the air and yanking out a red scroll. "Take this," she shouted. The scroll unraveled and spun around her in a spiral. She summoned weapons from each of the symbols and threw the summoned items at Tamari. A hail of weapons shot toward the blonde, who simply twitched her arm and all of the weapons fell to the ground, missing her completely. She held her fan beside her, one purple circle revealed. Tenten landed with shock written on her face. "What? My weapons, is there a trick to that fan?" she muttered. Tamari stared at her opponent and chuckled. "This is the first moon. There are two more. When you see 3 moons, it's over. Tenten. Don't let the enemy make you move at her pace. Stay calm. Stay calm." The green-clad genin shouted out again. The blonde kunoichi glared up at him. "Annoying little freak. You'll ruin all my fun." Suddenly the brunette smirked and pulled out 2 scrolls. She set the scrolls upright on the ground. Tamari chuckled. "No matter what you try, it's useless." Tenten made hand seals. "Sasharyu?" she cried. There was an explosion of smoke. Tamari lifted her arm slightly to cover her teal eyes. 2 dragons of smoke shot up into the air and began spiraling around one another in a deadly dance before turning back into scrolls. Tenten leapt into the air. She summoned numerous weapons and shot them toward Tamari fiercely. "Heh. Even if you increase the numbers, the outcome will be the same." Tamari hoisted her fan up and swung it, revealing the second purple circle. Second moon. The barrage of deadly weapons was blown away, scattering across the floor. Tenten landed on the ground, growling. "I'm not done yet." She leapt back up and swung her hands around, revealing that the many weapons were attached to strings. She brought the weapons back up again and shot them toward her blonde opponent. Tamari merely continued smirking and waved her fan, sending Tenten and the weapons flying away. The brunette skidded along the floor, crashing into several of her weapons as she slid. Tamari held her now completely open fan behind her in an artistic pose, showing that she was as graceful as she was deadly. "Third moon," she said. She swept the fan around her and vanished. Tenten gasped and looked around frantically. "Here." She whipped around. Tamari soared through the air, right over the leaf kunoichi. Their eyes met, both of them glaring. Tamari landed and grabbed her fan, snapping it shut briefly before revealing its full fold again. "Ninpu Kamitachi," she exclaimed. A violent whirlwind of wind blasted towards Tenten, who was easily caught and lifted into the air. Her mouth was open in a scream, but it was impossible to hear over the raging wind. Cuts began appearing on her body, tearing her clothing and sending small bouts of blood into the air. Finally, the raging tornado gave way and Tenten fell limply toward the ground. Temari held out her now closed fan and caught the girl on the end of it, forcing her body to bend at a violent, unnatural angle. Blood sprayed out of her mouth. Temari glared fiercely at the other female. That was boring. Very boring. Tate held out his arm. Winner, Temari. The blonde girl smirked and chucked Tenten's unconscious body away. The green freak appeared and caught her, frowning angrily. Nice catch. Temari said, smirking. Why did you do that? The freak demanded. Is that something you should do to someone who fought her hardest? Temari scowled and slammed her fan on the ground. Shut up. Take that piece of trash and leave. Idiot. None of these leaf ninja understood what it meant to be a Suna shinobi. They were trained to be the best, to be the strongest and most merciless shinobi there could be. There were few shinobi in the Sand Village, and so those available were trained to the fullest. There was no room for the weak or soft-hearted. Especially when you were related to the Kazekage himself. If she failed, it reflected directly on her country. Compassion was for outside of battle. To show it in a fight would make or break a mission. The green kid growled and rushed forward. Konoha senpyu. Temari merely sidestepped and blocked his leg. What? You're just like how you look, stupid. What did you say? The boy's identical teacher appeared. Temari wondered if they were related. Stop, Lee. Sensei. Temari, come back here. Gaara said. She looked over at him. You won. Stop dealing with that ugly guy and his guardian. She shrugged and consented. She was getting sick of looking at those two anyway. Lee frowned further at the ugly statement. What was that? He glared at Gaara, who stared back emotionlessly. Guy placed a hand on his student's shoulder. Just let it go, Lee. Guy smiled knowingly, his eyes shadowed. Gentleman from the sand, if I may warn you about one thing. Lee is stronger than he looks. You better be prepared for it. Gaara narrowed his black-rimmed eyes. Temari took her place beside him and suppressed a sigh. Those two were lucky they were Konoha shinobi. If they were back in Suna, they would be dead for saying that. The next few fights were of little interest to Temari, her mind wandering from subject to subject. She watched as yet another genin was carried away to the emergency room. It was a pale-eyed girl with short black hair. She watched the girl sympathetically. The girl had fought with everything she had against a stronger member of her family and still managed to lose. Nonetheless, Temari applauded the girl in her mind. The girl stubbornly refused to give up. And to Temari, that was the perfect example of what a true kunoichi should act like, very much unlike the two that had tied earlier. Gaara was shivering ever so slightly, his breath uneven. Kankuro looked at his brother uneasily. He must have watched that battle and gotten excited. Temari thought, lowering her eyes slightly, turquoise her eyes is filled with concern. That Niji guy interests me. Kankuro said. Let me go do something. Temari stepped out of his way as he began walking off. Kankuro. He waved his hand. I'm going to go on a little recon mission. The names on the screen began spinning, and Temari watched her brother walk over to dog-owning Konoha shinobi. Gaara made a hand sign and vanished in a swirl of sand, reappearing in the arena. Hurry up. The screen stopped. On the other side of the arena, a fat kid suddenly yelled safe. His teammates jumped and proceeded to knock him upside the head for being an idiot. The freaks in green began yelling and bouncing around again. Temari looked at the screen, which read Rock Lee, and raised an eyebrow at the screaming idiots. Are these two actually ninjas? The small freak jumped down into the arena, smiling. I'm very happy that I can fight you so early. Gaara stared with his usual expressionless face. I don't know what kind of moves that bobbed-haired guy uses, but he can't beat Gaara. Temari heard Kankuro say. Damn straight. Temari thought. He has speed, but his kick wasn't that great. Lee started and lifted his hand, catching the cork that flew out of Gaara's gourd. Don't be so hasty. He said, dropping the small item. Gaara glared, specks of sand beginning to float into the air. Begin. The green freak wasted no time in making his move, dashing forward. He leapt into the air and attempted to hit Gaara with his Konoha senpyu, only to be blocked by sand. The sand chased the green boy as he leapt away, reaching out a ways before backing off. Undaunted, he ran forward again, kicking and punching the sand shield multiple times. He drew a kunai as the sand attempted to get him from behind and slashed through the menacing tendrils. The green-clad ninja was clearly growing frustrated as his attacks continued to fail. Gaara didn't even move. Is that it? Gaara asked coldly. Let me enjoy this a little more. There isn't enough blood. The sand lashed out towards Lee. He attempted to leap out of the way, but the sand caught in around the ankle and whipped him around. He slammed into a wall, gasping to pull air back into his lungs. Another wave of sand came at him and he rolled out of the way, quickly getting to his feet and rushing once again. After another failed attempt, the sand followed him as he attempted to back away, tripping him. A hand of sand crashed down towards him, but he evaded in the nick of time, landing on the hand symbol monument. He stared down at Gaara, panting lightly. "Lee, take them off," his sensei suddenly yelled. The boy saluted, but his face was clouded with confusion. "But Guy-sensei, I thought that was only permitted when protecting many important people." The man gave him thumbs up. "This is an exception." Lee looked awed. "Really?" He laughed and pulled down his leg warmers, revealing weights. He pulled them off and stood. "All right. Now I can move freely." Temari rolled her eyes. "Taking off a couple pounds of weight won't enable you to catch up with Gaara's sand." But as the weights hit the ground, two massive craters came into existence. Her eyes widened. Then again shit. "Oh Lee." "Yes, sir." Lee vanished in a blur. For the first time in years, Gaara looked shocked. Out of nowhere, Lee's fist shot toward Gaara, barely blocked by the sand. The Redeed spun around in alarm. Another hit blew through the sand, barely missing, and another and yet another. Gaara was looking everywhere, trying to get a glimpse of his speedy opponent. One of Lee's hits slipped through the sand, it missed Gaara's head by centimeters. Then Lee was in the air, spinning. He brought his foot down in a harsh kick, Gaara's head following the movement violently. "Gaara!" Temari cried. The demon container backed away, a cut apparent on his features. His face was set in a glower of grudging respect. "I can't believe it. Gaara got wounded." Temari thought, her mouth agape. "The explosion of youth." Guy screeched. Lee rushed forward once again, grinning. Gaara took a step back and sent a wave of sand towards the freak, but he appeared from behind, his fist blocked once again. He vanished again, quickly. "Over here," Lee said. Gaara was spinning around, his eyes wide. A fist landed on Gaara's cheek, knocking him through the air. He skidded along the ground. Gaara stood with his face low, sand pouring out of his gourd. His arms hung by his sides limply as small bits of sand began crumbling off his face. Gaara looked up with an insane grin, shards of the sand shell covering his body falling apart. The sand rose up and began crawling back onto the Redeed. Temari pressed her lips together. "I felt that he was becoming more and more unstable as we progressed through the exams. Since Gaara was forced to use his sand armor, it proves that he's feeling the pressure right now. This could be bad if Shikaku awakens. Nonetheless, that Lee guy is pretty strong, but the outcome of this match will still be the same. He cannot defeat Gaara." "Is that all you've got?" Gaara asked, his arms crossed. However, the green-clad boy smiled. He undid some of the wrappings on his arms. "Prepare yourself," he exclaimed, rushing forward. He ran around Gaara in circles, a green blur. "Hurry up and come." Gaara sounded bored. "As you wish," Lee said excitedly, his foot suddenly coming from underneath and nailing Gaara in the jaw. His body was forced up into the air. Lee lumped up after him and kicked Gaara multiple times out of reach of the sand. The odd boy winced from pain. His wrappings lashed out and wrapped around Gaara, catching him in a cocoon. He twisted the two of them so that they were upside down and began spinning rapidly toward the ground. "Take this." Amoto Renge. They slammed into the ground like a human drill, sending dust and shards of broken concrete everywhere. Temari gasped, her hands flying up to her mouth. Gaara lay still on the ground, his eyes wide and cracks evident all over his body. That should have hurt. The proctor walked over to examine the body, but suddenly Gaara began falling apart, revealing that it had just been a Sunabushin. Temari sighed in relief, despite herself. She knew it had been a fake, and yet the sight of her little brother lying there like that. Lee stared in horror, his massive eyebrows twitching. "What?" A pillar of sand rose up behind the green ninja, sand sifting away to reveal Gaara and a crazed, bloodthirsty smile. He was chuckling. Temari's eyes widened. "That's his eyes, the demon has awakened. Damn that idiot leaf ninja." Sand shot around everywhere, attacking Lee viciously. The boy could hardly seem to move. His attack must have put a lot of strain on his body, damaging him. A huge wave of sand bashed into him, sending him spiraling into another wall. Gaara licked his lips hungrily. Lee panted, his chest heaving and his arms held out. Somehow he managed to dodge Gaara's next few attacks. Gaara brought his hands into a sign and hit Lee with another attack. The leaf ninja cried out of pain. He should just give up already. Temari said to herself. Gaara was just playing with him now. It was another deadly game of cat and mouse. Gaara's breathing was rough as he grinned down at the fallen leaf nin. "Ha. So useless." The sand moved forward once again and pummeled Lee. Sand flew across the arena and by the expression on the boy's face, it was clear to everyone that the freak had come to a decision. "No Lee-san. If you fight anymore you'll die," the pink-haired girl exclaimed. But Lee dodged the attack, his speed restored. Gaara stared on, annoyed. Burst of sand shot toward him, but he dodged time and time again. Suddenly, the area around the freak became heavy with power. Gaara glowered. I don't know what you're trying to do, but you're going to be finished here. Yes. Either way, the next move will end everything. Lee said. I cannot be the only one who loses here. Gaara's eyes widened a fraction at the sheer amount of power rolling off of his opponent. Sensei, please acknowledge this now as the time chunks of stone flew around the air, held up by chakra was so thick it was visible. To abide and protect my way of the ninja. Third gate, life gate, open. He exclaimed. Temari's mouth was agape. This kid could open the gates. This could actually be very bad. She watched as his skin turned red. Now to the fourth gate, wing gate, open. He screamed. The sheer force of power seemed to be ripping him apart. He sped off again at inhuman speeds, the ground tearing up in his wake. Gaara was once again kicked into the air. Temari glanced around frantically before glancing up. Bataudo! She exclaimed as he flew through the air, cringing in pain. The sand slowly moved up toward Gaara. The sand isn't fast enough anymore. Gaara, you have to end this quickly. Crack spider webbed across Gaara's face. The sand armor again. Lee said, rushing forward. Then how about this? He appeared in front of Gaara and hit him, sending him flying in another direction, the shockwave of the hit causing the room to tremble. He shot all around the room, pummeling Gaara from all sides. The Suna no Yoroi was falling apart. Panic spread across Temari's features. You're tough. Lee stated, bouncing around. But he balled his hand into a fist. This is the end. Fifth gate, the forest gate, open. He cried. Gaara moved his hands in front of him defensively, eyes wide. Lee nailed him square in the stomach. The Redeed flew towards the ground, but the green-clad boy grabbed a hold of his sash and pulled him back into the air. The shield of sand cannot catch up. And most of his armor of sand is gone. Gaara. Lee drove his fist down mercilessly. You're a wrench. He screamed as they flew into the ground. The crater made enormous. Dust and debris shot through the air, forcing Temari to close her eyes and shield her face with her arms. She managed to glimpse, however, that at the last moment, the Gaara's gourd turned into sand and cushioned his fall. Lee crashed into the ground, utterly spent. Gaara! Kankuro exclaimed, gripping the hand railing. Gaara lay on the ground, trembling, his breath heavy and sand spread across the floor. His eyes were filled with fury. He held out his hand. The sand flew towards Lee, who tried weakly to crawl away. The sand crawled over his left leg and arm. Sabaku Sosu. Gaara declared, making a fist. Lee screamed as the sand crushed his limbs savagely. He fell to the ground, broken concrete etching across his back. Gaara sent more sand towards the boy. Die. However, the sand suddenly dispersed, driven away by the boy's instructor. Gaara sat up, his eyes showing surprise and fury. The two males stared at one another. Gaara suddenly winced, gripping his head in pain. He looked over at the man. Why? He gasped through the memories being forced through his head. Why did you help him? He's because he is precious to me. Gaara's head tilted slightly, uncomprehending. Precious to you? Temari questioned. That's something that Gaara cannot understand. Gaara stood up and walked off, his gourd reforming. I quit. Paid held up his hand, the winner having already been decided the moment Guy interfered. Winner, Ga. Everyone gasped. Gaara paused and looked back at Lee, who was shakily standing up again. Blood dripped from his wounds. This can't be, Guy said in disbelief. Gaara turned toward the green-clad boy again, prepared to finish him off. I walked over to the boy and held his shoulder. Lee, it's okay, it's over. You shouldn't stand up. Suddenly, Guy's face took on an expression of horror. Liu tears began to fall. Are you trying to prove your way of the ninja, even after you have lost consciousness? Temari's eyes widened. The boy was out cold, huh? The green man pulled the boy to him and hugged him gently. Lee's eyes slipped shut. Lee, you are an excellent ninja already. Winner, Gaara. He said in a somber tone. HN. There's no way you can defeat Gaara. Temari said to herself, watching as Guy carefully laid Lee on the ground. Gaara's face was closed and bitter, but to Temari, his eyes told all. They were eyes filled with hate and envy. Those jade eyes were almost enough to make Temari's eyes burn. She bit her lip, keeping an unaffected expression on her face. The medics arrived quickly and examined the leaf ninja, a green glow emitting from their hands. It didn't take long for one of the medics to take Guy aside and announce to him that Lee's days as a ninja were over. The man was nearly brought to tears again. Temari wasn't surprised. Gaara watched as they carried Lee's broken body to the hospital. Guy turned away a broken man. A red-haired brother closed his eyes and vanished in a swirl of sand, reappearing next to his sister. Temari greeted him with a smile. Welcome back, Gaara. She said, unable to hide her relief. He shot her a sparing glance, and for a moment, in that particular light, Temari could have almost sworn there was a hint of a smile on his face. Not a crazy one either. It completely made her day. The final match was pathetic. It didn't even last 2 minutes before the sound genin knocked the fat kid out with a single hit. After the pitiful display, they received their instructions for the main matches. Temari was to go last, fighting against either the shadow user or the haystack guy from the sound. The Hokage gave her a strange look as he spoke that left her puzzled and wary. Then they were dismissed. Temari breathed in the clean, outside air as she left the building with her brothers. She was glad to be out of that hot, smelly arena. It stank of sweat. She glanced around at the bustling village and came to a decision. "I'm going to the hot springs," she said, walking off. "What do you need to go to the hot springs for?" Kankuro asked incredulously. "You just took a shower this morning." She looked back at him. "Yeah, and we just finished fighting. I don't want to smell like you." Kankuro huffed and crossed his arms. Gaara stood there for a moment before walking in the same direction Temari had gone in. Kankuro looked at him. "Where are you going?" "I don't want to smell like you, either." Kankuro yelled in fury and grabbed at his head. "You guys really suck." Temari sighed happily as she lowered her body into the hot, steamy water of the baths. Yes, this was the life. The stress knots in her shoulders loosened and relaxed. She ran her moistened fingers through her short, bushy, blonde hair. She rolled her shoulders once before dipping her head in the water and soaking her locks. She sighed again and looked up at the sky. What a week. She couldn't remember a week as hectic as this one, but then, she'd never been in a Chuunin Exam before, so it wasn't completely unexpected. A few more women walked into the bath. Temari hadn't ordered a private one, she didn't feel the need, she wasn't in Suna with her overprotective brothers, even if Gaara didn't show it. And it wasn't as if anybody here would remember her face anyway. If it weren't for everyone in Suna being terrified of Gaara, she'd probably be beating suitors off in hordes. Being his sister did have its perks, she had no interest in romance at this time in her life. She giggled to herself as she remembered an incident when she was 12. One of the local boys came over to the house asking for her hand in marriage. It was kind of cute, seeing as he was a good 4 years younger than her, simply an ignorant child with a crush. But Kankuro had nearly castrated the poor kid, chasing him off with one of his first puppets. Kankuro still had the scar from Temari's fan. Her thoughts were shattered when she heard an odd girly giggling sound. She looked at the other women. No, none of them were giggling. They were just relaxing in the hot water. She looked around as the sound reached her ears again. Her eyes grazed along the fence and her eyes stopped on a small hole in the wood. An eye was peeping through it. She screamed. "Pervert." Gaara sunk down into the water, his clothing and gourd piled neatly in a corner of the private spring. The water clouded a bit as grains of sand spread throughout the bath. He pondered upon his fight today with the freak in the green leotard, however, he wasn't thinking about the strange boy. He heard, quite clearly, Temari call him a Tauto at one point when he was being pummeled. It troubled him. He cared nothing for his siblings and as far as he knew, they didn't care for him either. However, Temari's reaction to his battle suggested otherwise. Especially when he reappeared beside her in the stands. He had rarely heard her sound too sincerely concerned before and it was aimed at him. But why? Forget the incident. She was lying to you. She doesn't really care for you, she was just pretending. Mother. She's like all the rest, Gaara. I'm the only one that truly cares for you, don't forget that. You don't love anybody. Nobody cares about you, especially not her. But mother, what if she does? What if she really does care? Could. Silence. Gaara grasped his skull, cringing. She does not care for you. No one could ever love a monster like you, Gaara. You only have yourself to love. Gaara bit his lip. But. Why must you press upon this issue? She does not love you at all. I thought you cared about me, Gaara. But it seems I was wrong. Perhaps I shall die. No. I am sorry, mother. Please forgive me. You're right, you're always right. I'll be a good boy, mother. I'm such a good boy. Please don't die, mother. I don't want you to die. I'm a good boy. Good. Gaara sank down into the water, only his eyes staying above the surface. Small bubbles rose up. His emotionless mask was gone for the time being, exposing the immensely sad, lost child within. Mother was right. Mother was always right. Still, he wished someone would. Pervert. He sat up. That was Temari's voice. Several other female screeches followed. He quickly preformed the Justu for the third eye. He had it materialize in the direction the voices were coming from and found himself smirking. Temari and several other towel-clad women were beating the lights out of an apparently perverted old man with bizarre white hair. Temari was using her fan quite viciously. Oh, not the face. Not the face. Pervert. Bet him. You gross old man. Creep. Sicko. Is that how you get your freak on? Huh. I'm going to castrate you. Temari yelled, bring her fan down especially hard. The man trembled in fear and horror. Oh god no. Not there please. Ara chuckled despite himself. Perhaps Kankuro was right. It was entertaining to watch Temari fight. Stars glittered. The moon grinned down. A toothy skull bleached white by the sun. The soft glow of windows warmed the otherwise cold dark streets. A lunar moth made its way through the sky, beating its wings frantically. In all honesty, Temari felt quite foolish, sneaking around Konoha's empty alleyways in the middle of the night. There were a hundred really different moments when choosing to sneak out of the city limits was at a much better time, the middle of the day, for example, or even at dusk. But she had, too conveniently, let those chances pass by, and now she found herself slinking around in the dark. Of course, the full moon played no small role either. She'd awoken to the sound of fighting, and not long after she opened her eyes, blood dripped down from the ceiling. No doubt it was Gaara's work. The Konoha patrol hadn't proven to be a hindrance to her yet. In actuality, it was her sensei, Baki, who nearly caught her own fault for being too close after he'd caught an eavesdropping leaf nin. Quite miraculously, or just a stroke of odd fortune, a runaway cat had saved Temari. She doubted Baki would have punished her much if at all if he'd caught her, but this was one personal mission she didn't plan on revealing to her teacher just yet. He was too aggressive and straightforward to handle things the way she thought they ought to be. She slipped out through the west gate once again and kept out of the road, taking refuge in the thick moist foliage. Ferns jutted out like giant green feathers. Toadstools staircased up trees until they could no longer be seen from the ground. Dead leaves curled around tiny verdant fingers of new growth. Long dead twigs were too waterlogged with dew to snap. She hadn't brought her battle fan with her this time. It was too obvious a weapon, too easily deemed a threatening object. However, the small folding fan tucked into her obi ensured that she would not be completely helpless if things turned for the worse. She finally found him sitting on a boulder, one knee propped up, tails fanning out over the stone like rivers of gold. Everything from his hair to his skin and even his clothing looked muted in the pale glow of the moon. His eyes, as blue as the sea, was the only part of his person that seemed to glow brighter. It wasn't until he spoke that she realized she had been staring. Why don't you run? She blinked, coming back to awareness, and licked the back of her teeth. Excuse me? She stiffened instinctually as he looked away from the sky, his eyes resting upon her form. She couldn't help but lift her arms to cover herself, for it felt as if he were looking through her clothes, through her. Everyone runs. He stated simply. You ran, before. Why are you not running now? She steeled herself, glaring back at him defiantly. I have something I need to find out. One nostril widened, twitched freely, and he looked back at the sky, as if deeming her something no longer to be bothered with. Despite the action, he did not ignore her. You did not find that out last time you trespassed into my domain. There are more things I need to know. Then ask them. Temari was surprised, though she did not show it. She had expected him to be more reluctant to speak with her. Well, one shouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth. She thought. Two of his tails twitched about aimlessly. Are you an enemy of Konoha? No. Her stomach nodded. Then you are its ally. He actually laughed at that, a short bark that caught her unawares. Not as such. He glanced at her and continued, spotting her frown. Konoha is part of my territory, but I hold no great love for it. Not anymore. Temari raised an eyebrow, but did not prod. In that case, what would you do if, hypothetically, an invading force came for Konoha through your forest? He was fully facing her now, looking dangerously amused. Konoha is my territory. They would not reach it. It was unspoken, but the intentions behind those words echoed loudly through the small clearing. I will kill them. I see. She pinched her lips together. Her insecurities confirmed, she turned and moved to walk away. Hypothetically, he began, causing her to pause and glance back. What nations would be involved in such a situation? She spun around to face him, her instincts on high alert. He was no longer sitting on his rock, he was standing. 8 she counted, he has 8 tails. He's short one. Her hand went to the small fan in her obi. I don't see why that would matter to why. He'd closed the distance between them in an instant, grabbing her wrist with enough force to make her cry out in pain and surprise. He narrowed his eyes at her. I answered your questions, so now you shall answer mine. His claw-like nails dug into her wrist, forcing her to drop her fan to the ground. He grabbed her other shoulder with his remaining hand and pulled her right up against him, staring down on her. Despite the pain, she felt a savage blush burn across her cheeks and creep up her neck. She had never been this physically close to any man who wasn't family or an enemy. His masculine smell was overpowering and made her feel light in the head. He tilted his head at her reaction, puzzled, having expected her to struggle in some way. He had a roundness to his face that gave away his youth. He couldn't have been much older than her, perhaps even a bit younger. From the angle he held her in, she could see the whiskers on his cheeks clearly. The whiskers were still ugly, but they were ugly the same way Gaara's eyes were ugly. They defined him in some way, he wouldn't be who he was without them. His golden eyebrows were furrowed, his eyes hard with frustration. "Why don't you run?" he ground out. She moved her gaze to stare him in the eye. "Should I run?" His grip slackened, and his face evened out in shock. "Should you?" he echoed, but everyone always his words faded and she stared up at him defiantly. "You are an odd one, aren't you?" Temari could see that he was having a difficult time comprehending what she had said. They were no longer touching, he had backed up about a foot still uncomfortably close. She decided to distract him with the simplest question that came to mind. "What is your name?" He blinked and, surprisingly, smiled. Suddenly, he didn't seem so frightening nor his cheek so ugly. "No one's asked me for my name before. My name is Naruto." She nodded tensely. "I'm Dot." "Oh, I already know who you are," he interrupted, looking away. His eyes were once more focused on the moon. "You should go back to the village now," he uttered rather softly. She didn't dare protest. She eyed him once more from his bare feet to his limp cloak and sunny hair. "Good night." He turned to look at her yet again, but she had already taken to the trees, her fan forgotten. He picked up the small object, turning it over in his hands. He continued to frown. "You are a very odd individual, Temari. Very." Temari wouldn't call herself a bad cook. Kankuro might, but despite his jokes, she couldn't really burn water. She honestly wasn't a bad cook, though, Temari had to admit, she was a far cry from what one would call a skilled chef. That still didn't explain why the sweet omelette she'd made was growling. She stood with Kankuro over the plate, staring at the scrambled yellow protein. Snarling noises emanated from the table each time they attempted to fork the food. "Geez, Temari, are you trying to poison me or something?" Kankuro asked, staring at the offending mass. His hood, for once, was down. "Don't be stupid," she snapped. He pulled down his eyelid. She stuck out her tongue. Frustrated, he finally slammed the fork into the, now cold, meal. "Damn," growling Amel unexpectedly, a small grey form blurred out from under the table and latched onto Kankuro's wrist. "Holy," Temari exclaimed. "Fox!" Kankuro yelled. "Fox. It's a fucking fox." "Kankuro, stop. Get it the hell off me, now. I would if you'd stop waving your arm around like an idiot." She managed to latch her hands around the animal's middle. It shuddered as if ticklish and immediately stopped biting her brother's hand. It didn't stay in her grasp for long, however, wiggling free and leaping onto the table to start devouring the no longer growling omelet. Kankuro cradled his hand, which was starting to turn red with irritation. "Damn animal. You'd better not have rabies, fox." "I'll take care of it." Temari sighed, picking the fox up by the scruff of its neck and took it outside. She resisted the urge to pinch her nose against the creature's potent musk. Setting it down in an alleyway, she put her hands on her hips, glaring. The fox seemed oblivious to the trouble it had gotten itself into, licking its maw of any remaining egg bits. "He sent you to spy on us, didn't he?" she asked the animal. Unsurprisingly, it didn't respond. Temari crossed her arms. "Well, tell him to stop, because I don't appreciate being stalked." The little grey fox proceeded to urinate on the side of a garbage can. This time Temari really did pinch her nostrils closed. "Ugh. You guys smell as bad as skunks do." She turned away. "I don't want to see you milling about our hotel room again, got it?" She was preaching to deaf ears. The kitsune kicked dirt over the side of the can and bounded away. It had been a very long time since Temari was homesick. Foreigners always talked of how lifeless and barren the desert was, they complained about the scorching days and whined about the frigid nights and only saw the desperation and death that the golden grains of sand brought to travelers. They didn't see that things didn't have to be green to be full of life and the desert was teeming with it. Sidewinder snakes broke cresting ripples of sand, cacti flourished fat and plump with sea urchin-shaped flowers, kangaroo mice munched on dry seeds, only to be snapped up by an enormous eared fennec fox looking to feed her kits, the horned lizard squirted blood at predators from its eyes. The list went on, and yet it still only scratched the surface. Dig down a little deeper and still more creatures make themselves known. Though, these ones were much more dangerous. Tarantulas, wasps, biting ants, and scorpions. Scorpions were probably the deadliest of all. All villages have their rebels, civilian or shinobi. Whether or not those rebels do anything significant is a matter of motivation among other things. Some villages have prisoners who felt they have been mistreated, some have Warhawk old men with his secret web of spies, and others have groups of children who have something to prove, groups like Sunagakur's Black Scorpion Gang. She's late. They hadn't been impressive at first, just a bunch of young people with radical ideas about how the government should have been run. More of a club, really, that met at night in the abandoned catacombs underneath the city. They had first found their way down through sewage pipes and the emergency evacuation tunnels. Then Akasuna no Sasori came. The man aptly named the Red Scorpion. Even after he had been declared a missing nin, the Black Scorpion was no longer the little fledgling group it once was. After Sasori, things down there became serious. Underneath the sandy village of Sunagakure no Sato was an entire other city, inhabited by rebels waiting for the opportunity to change the way things were run up above. No few people knew it was there, but it was a small number that knew how large it was, and fewer still knew the way down. Yeah, you wind users, so touchy about your air. Temari was one such person. It wasn't a group she was proud to be associated with. At one point, she had been, but as a young woman nearing 19 years of age, she no longer saw a coup as a good method of changing things. She was the daughter of the Yondaime Kizikage, she grew up in politics, and she knew now that it was words, not force, that would be most effective in changing the way soon as government was run. Unfortunately, quitting the Black Scorpion was no cakewalk. "She's late," he muttered, exhaling a generous plume of smoke, again. The 15-year-old Temari ignored her partner's obvious statement, picking at her battle kimono. There were several things that she would have preferred to be doing at the moment, sleeping, for example, but instead she found herself crouched in an alley in the wee hours of the morning, waiting for a person she wanted little to do with. She looked over at the cigarette suddenly held beside her face. Scowling, she knocked his hand away. "Sakata, get that shit out of my face." Her partner sighed, rolling his eyes. "TCH. Yeah, you wind users, so touchy about your air. One drag ain't gonna kill you, Goldilocks." "Oh, shut it." She ignored his deep throaty laugh in favor of watching a new person form out of the shadows. She was older than Temari and of a slimmer build due to a childhood illness. Her hair gleamed fire while amber eyes glinted sharply over the surgeon's mask covering most of her face. She wasn't built like a fighter, even if the sandy-colored trench coat she wore implied differently, but her eyes were intelligent. And Temari knew that the damage this girl could do with her tongue was often more devastating than the damage an explosive tag could do. "Aiko," Sakata stated, dropping his death stick to the ground and scuffing it out with the toe of his shoe, "you're late." Her back to the floor, Temari traced her finger over the tiny scorpion tattoo just beneath her armpit, the brand that forever marked her as a person against her father. The reminder she could never rid herself of, no matter how far she ran. "Hey Goldilocks." The tattoo was proof of her betrayal to her own village. "Haven't seen you down here in a while." Blowing her arm, Temari rolled onto her belly and looked out the window of her room. 100 miles away from home, yet the sky still bore the same stars. She stood and a moment later the hotel room was empty. It was a rare occasion, indeed, that the Sandaime Hokage came outside the village walls to pay a visit to the foxes that inhabited the forest. And he did indeed pay because each time he came, they demanded food. Some of the older foxes watched the younger ones eat from the sidelines, too old and spiteful to eat from the banquet offered to them, yet willing to show their respect to the older man by allowing themselves to be seen. Only the will of their prince and master prevented some of those older ones from filtering into the Hidden Leaf village and killing its inhabitants. The demon prince's power was not absolute just yet. Said young man, 8 tails seeming to float behind him, dismissed a large blue-gray fox with a wave of his hand. Their discussion ended. He turned to the weathered Hokage. "I apologize, here is an Oji-san, my foxes have not caught a whiff of this Orochimaru. Only Ren spotted him in the Forest of Death, but you are already aware of what happened there. The serpent population is still on the rise, they're flocking to the area, so I believe he cannot be far." The old man nodded. "I see. I appreciate the effort anyway, Naruto-kun. It's no trouble. Though, I think Ren might." A small strawberry blonde fox rubbed up against his leg. Naruto sighed and crossed his arms, a teasing glitter in his eyes. "She may want a special treat as payment, am I right, Ren?" The young fox yipped happily. Sarutobi Hiruzen chuckled, kneeling to scratch the kit behind one ear. "I apologize, dear one. You will have to wait until next time." Ren seemed to pout but licked his hand in understanding. A few of the older foxes bristled but made no threatening movements. The little kitsune put her nose into the air and sniffed when the old man pulled away. She yipped excitedly, dashing off. The juvenile's actions made Naruto pinch his lips, his left hand fiddling with a small fan absently. The object did not escape Sarutobi's notice and he narrowed his eyes at the Suna insignia etched into the wooden frame. "Where did you get that fan, Naruto-kun?" The demon prince's skin shifted with veiled surprise and he ducked his hand behind his back. "It was on the ground," he said shortly. It wasn't a satisfying answer, but the aged Hokage didn't dare pry. He only hoped that the young prince wasn't plotting something against Konohagakure. Like finishing what Kyuubi no Yoko started, it was an old worry that had never truly died out. Sarutobi's unease did not go unnoticed and Naruto sought to end their encounter. The old man had the most peculiar ways of deciphering the demon prince's body language and having his private thoughts exposed was not an experience he enjoyed. And Hiruzen and his Anbu guards were not the only one paying the demon prince's forest a visit right now. his feet itched to move. Thankfully, for once, Saratobi left him to his unease without much resistance, and Cat and Eagle, vanishing in twin leafy dust devils. The golden-haired man dashed off within the span of a heartbeat. The intruder was the Suna woman again, Tamari. She sensed his presence almost immediately, and he didn't bother hiding, walking into the light with a beepy smirk. What brings the lady back? She wasn't amused and held up a guilty-looking grey kitsune by its scruff. I don't appreciate being stalked, Demon Prince. I assure you, you're not being stalked. I observe all foreigners that come into my territory. Tamari's face was marred by a sneer. Call it whatever you like, I don't want you or for foxes watching me anymore. Oh, she was funny. What makes you think it's you I'm so interested in? You're just a human. His eyes widened in comprehension. My brother. It's Gar you're keeping tabs on. He smiled and she was unable to determine if it was friendly or malicious. So that's his name. Gara, eh? Tamari huffed and dropped the fox. It landed with cat-like grace and scampered to its master's side. You stay away from him. Gara has it hard enough as it is. She said, turning on her heel, chin high with pride. Miss Tamari. She paused and glanced back warily. The prince rolled his wrist. Come, walk with me. She hesitated with shock before deciding the best course of action was following, soon falling into step beside him. Speckles of green, gray, and sunshine yellow fell upon them from between the tree's thick foliage. Naruto had his clawed hands held behind his back and she noticed her fan was in his grasp. He still smelled. Did you want it back? She jumped a little. He had noticed her staring. She glanced away, pink with embarrassment. No, I have others. I don't need it. He smiled, eyes bright. I will keep it then. Thank you. Tamari stopped in her tracks, eyes narrow. The demon prince paused several feet away, half turned toward the female. Yes. Your personality is so different from what I expected. Not at all like what I read. Naruto was surprised. There's a book about me? Tamari crossed her arms. The Kyuubi, yes. You're not at all like the legends say. Of course not. I'm not father, I'm me. I suppose you're exactly like your mother, are you? She wondered at the title father. It was parallel to Gara calling a chibi mother. But unlike her brother, the tales that swayed with the demon prince's every step, his back-swept ears, his sharp predatory eyes, were too real to be the delusions of a half-mad young man. Naruto began walking and again stopped, looking vaguely annoyed that she did not immediately follow as expected. Why have you asked me to walk with you? He didn't miss a beat. I answered your questions. You have yet to answer mine. Her pretty face turned into a scowl. Is that it? I believe I already gave you my answer to that the last time we met. The atmosphere between them suddenly turned predatory and Tamari froze in place, heart rate accelerating. He approached her in one smooth movement and grabbed her chin forcefully between his thumb and forefinger. I do not just give out information, he growled, this not a give-take situation, Miss Tamari. Somehow, she managed to swallow through the knot in her throat and was thankful he couldn't see her fingers trembling. What do you want to know? Unexpectedly, he shrugged as he released her and jumped into the tree branches above her. I haven't decided yet. She took a steadying breath. Now he was just making her angry. What do you mean you haven't decided? What is the point of me still being here, then? He stared down at her from between his bare toes. You are here because, until I have decided what to ask, you will be coming back to me every day. It was too much. She gaped at him, open-mouthed. You? Ridiculous. I have finals to train for. His eyes were hard. It was not a request. Who do you think you are? I'm not some minion of yours to call it your every whim and fancy. Naruto was unfazed. Nevertheless, I expect you to come visit tomorrow preferably after dark and the days after until I have been compensated. You infuriating man. She exclaimed, stomping her foot. You stubborn, infuriating, son of a. I wouldn't finish that sentence if I were you. He chimed, smiling impishly, but there was a dangerous gleam in his alien blue gaze. She growled a half-hearted attempt at suppressing a frustrated scream and walked away. See you tomorrow, Tamari-san. The demon prince said cheerily, waving. This time she really did scream. Something was up. Despite his detachment from his blood siblings, Gara noticed a lot more than he let on. If Tamari or Kankuro so much as blew their noses, it didn't escape his notice. Now, noticing and paying attention are two very different things. Just because he noticed something didn't necessarily mean that he cared heads or tails about it. But, there were rare occasions where something his siblings did required confrontation. Tamari's affiliation with the Black Scorpion was one such a problem, but this time, he didn't imagine it'd be so easy to find out what she was doing. Whatever it was interfering with their mission. He would put an end to it. Tell me about your brother. Tamari glared at the demon prince of Konohagakure no Sado. If I answer, do I get to leave? He popped a ball of dango between his lips and chewed. Heaven knows how he got his hands on the sweet. His eyes were squinted into narrow slivers. Probably not. The woman huffed and crossed her arms. Then I'm not telling you. Suit yourself. He seemed content to wait until she was annoyed to the point of screaming everything he wanted to know at him. Another dango disappeared into his mouth. She caught a glimpse of sharp, inhumanly long canines. The Inyazuka had nothing on this guy's teeth. The demon prince wasn't much of a host. Their encounters consisted of walking through the forest or sitting around for hours on end. When he thought of a question, she would stubbornly refuse to answer, and the fact that he seemed content to let her sulk only served to infuriate her further. She simply hoped that, underneath his mocking grin, he was growing just as frustrated as she was. They continued to sit in near silence, the sound of chewing grated on Temari's nerves. Her teeth ground against each other, and she made a point of looking at everything except for the yellow-haired demon sitting beside her. Ara turned 16 this winter, she began, ignoring his burning gaze now settling on her cheek. Our mother died birthing him. Sometimes, deep down, I blame him for our family being a mess. He doesn't see Kankuro or me as siblings. I think he's had it as hard as you, maybe worse, because the Ichibi hates him. He's never slept a day in his life. Naruto's stare made her skin writhe. And what makes you think QB doesn't hate me? She looked at him then out of the corner of her eye. You're its heir, aren't you? He spread his hands. And that means what? A demon's first priority, like that of any creature, is to survive. Father's determination to live on through me is born simply of that instinct. It does not make him resent me any less or love me any more. Our lives are bound together. If I die, he dies. The person you see before you is no more than the result of a mutual agreement from the desire to live. She was facing him fully now, eyes meeting his unflinchingly. You are a very unpredictable person. Everything that comes out of your mouth is so. He grinned, resting his chin on his open palm. Everything that comes out of my mouth is so what? Surprising, she finished somewhat lamely. Surprising didn't even begin to cover it, but I think I'm staring to figure you out. His grin widened. Really now? Really? He stood then and held out one clawed hand. Come on, I'd like to show you something. Temari stared at his hand for a moment. I take it back. I have no idea what to make of you. Just come on. He laughed, taking a hold of her wrist when she didn't take his offered palm. Her body was tense with suspicion. Where are you taking me? You make it sound as if I were kidnapping you. You could be, for all I know. Now what could I possibly gain from spiriting you away? Oh, a great number of things. Money, power over Sunagaker, but I don't suppose those sort of things interest you. Not really, no. What would you do if you had me as a hostage? He grinned at her over his shoulder. I'd make you my pleasure slave, of course. Temari's expression darkened. Kidding. Kidding. I'm not so dishonorable to do something so terrible as that. You can be assured that the only thing I want from you is information. Joy, the brass-haired woman deadpanned. Naruto stopped and sighed, crossing his arms as he turned to face her. Really now, Miss Temari, after complaining so much about not getting to prepare for your finals, you could at least act a little bit grateful that I'm going to let you train in my forest. Temari felt her heart skip at the unexpected statement. You're going to let me train? Here? No, not here. I won't have you chopping my trees to pieces. Just come on. You'll see when we get there. And see she did. The rare vastness of open space deep within the otherwise claustrophobic forest, it was the perfect place to work on wind techniques without causing mass destruction. Like the open field she had come across the first day they met, strange white flowers dotted the landscape, though in much smaller numbers. Their heavy eggshell-shaped buds leaned heavily over the glassy surface of a small turquoise lake, bowed like praying monks. The sky was visible, unmasked by the verdant heavy boughs of trees. The yellowing stalks of grass shone gold under the burning sun. The demon prince finally released his hold on her hand and spread his arms in a grand gesture of presentation. His whisker-marred face glowed with pride. Isn't it great? His expression was expectant. Temari looked around with an indifferent gaze and crossed her arms. You're just trying to butter me up, aren't you? His smile turned to the. You catch more flies with honey than vinegar. She allowed herself to smirk back. Well, keep it up, it's working. She was without her beloved battle fan. But with their training sessions quickly becoming routine, it was hardly a problem. She had no new techniques to perfect, so Temari spent most of her time keeping her skills up to par while the demon prince watched. Once, she asked him to spar with her, but he politely declined without giving any reason as to why. She didn't ask again. More often than before, he asked her questions. Always she would ask. Do I get to leave if I answer? And always he would reply. Probably not. If she felt like it at the time, she would give him an answer, and other times she just kept on swinging her fan. It was of little surprise to her that he replied as he did. His questions were nothing remarkable. He never asked about the upcoming invasion, though his eyes glowed with knowing, and never did he ask about her private life. She hadn't quite noticed yet, but she was starting to look forward to their meetings, their long silences, and the demon prince's detached yet curious questions. Naruto, on the other hand, had noticed. "I don't understand. You've been alone too long, kid." He tore his eyes away from the rabbit in the moon, his awareness shrinking into himself. "I'm not alone. I have you, I have Ren and Nichi and all of the other foxes. I am not alone at all." "It is not the same." "The same as what, father?" "You are approaching your 16th summer, my son. You must find a mate by that date when you will receive your Daikyu no Shippo. You are of the Kitsune, yes, but they are not of you. None of them can be your mate." "I know that. But you still do not understand." "No. It will come to you in time. It must." The Kyuubi heaved a deep rumbling sigh. "I have exhausted my consciousness. I bid you good night, my son." "Good night, father." Naruto still couldn't understand. Temari watched as her youngest sibling finished his meal and left. Kankuro had a puzzled expression on his currently unpainted face, but Temari wasn't so ignorant. Gaara had noticed her nightly escapades, and he was starting to pay attention to them. It wasn't a good revelation. "Watch it, Goldilocks." His attention made her wary and afraid. It wouldn't have been the first time he'd gotten involved in her business because he didn't approve of something she was doing, missions or morals be damned. This was different though, because they weren't in their home village, nor did it involve their home village. "I had to pull a lot of strings to get that, be grateful." She worried. She worried about how this would affect their mission. She worried about what would happen if her youngest brother came face to face with the demon prince of Konoha. And she still worried entirely too little. Sakata tossed Aiko a small bag. "I'll have you know getting into the greenhouses weren't easy," he said, eyes narrowed as she sniffed at the contents, "and I still don't get what you'd need those little flowers for. You making a poison antidote or something?" Iridi'd stowed the sack in one of her many pockets. "Not your problem, Sui-chan." Her amber eyes turned to Temari's crouched form. "And you?" The blonde teen sighed, standing. "Don't get your panties in a bunch, Aiko. I've got it. Watch it, Goldilocks. Don't think I'm going to treat you special just because you're the Kazekage's firstborn." Temari handed over a small, silver dagger that had belonged to her grandfather, the Niddame Kazekage. "Special treatment from you, Aiko, would be an insult. You have what we want." The yellow-eyed girl jerked her head to the side. "It's in the burrow. It wouldn't have been much a problem just bringing Sakata's thing, but yours would have been too conspicuous." Temari nodded. "Let's go then." The burrow was the name for the catacombs that the members of the Black Scorpion dwelled in. Few people actually lived down in that dark dwelling, and those that did were usually kids that had run away from home or been kicked out. If someone in the village went missing, the chances were high that they could be found in the burrow, living or otherwise. Sasori of the Red Sand had been one of the more famous members. It was a breeding ground for black trade, mistrust, and violence, especially among the teens, but nevertheless, Temari felt more at home in the burrow than she ever did up on the surface. Here, she had people who could understand her and who would give a damn if she died. They were closer to being her family than her father and brothers ever were. The three presented their tattoos to the entrance guards, as well as relaying the week's password. Temari recognized the door guard as a feminine boy named Jen she used to go to school with. A strip of blood-stained bandages covered his left eye socket. His eye had been gouged out less than a week ago in a brawl with one of the more experienced gang members. He smiled weakly upon seeing her. "Hey Goldilocks. Haven't seen you down here in a while," he said. She nodded at him. "O2 team's been keeping my team rather busy since Gaara graduated and joined up with us. I haven't had a lot of time." "Well, it's good to have you back." "Boy, Temari." Sakata's voice interrupted the brief conversation. He now held a worn blue book in his hand. Aiko, her eyes hard, shoved a large battle fan into Temari's arms. "I had to pull a lot of strings to get that, be grateful." The blonde unfurled the hefty weapon, revealing its white base and simple purple moons. "Kind of plain, isn't it? Don't complain." The other female snapped, crossing her arms. "You don't have time. That Miss Yuzu girl of yours showed up. She's in the halls." Temari's eyes widened. "Miss Yuzu?" Things Gaara got involved in never ended well. This time was bound to be no different. However, this wasn't the finals and it and the invasion were still a ways off. Casualties outside the exam could not happen until then. Gaara had already pushed his luck by slaughtering Dosuo Futagakur. "I knew I'd find you here." She had to do something to keep Gaara out of confrontation. Excusing herself from the table, Kankuro watched as she retreated to her room. He didn't see her slip silently out her window. Temari was not unskilled when it came to covering her tracks. It was just that Gaara was better, and it was because he was better that he could find and follow her shallow footprints, the trail of wet crinkled leaves, the low branches missing their dew. You're getting close, Gaara. Yes, mother. His breath trembled as he licked his lips in anticipation. He always looked forward to bloodshed, but this was different. His body hummed with strength, senses on high alert. He hadn't even set eyes on his opponent yet, and he was more excited than he could ever remember being. It wasn't some pitiful human that he would be crushing this time. Mother could feel it, he could feel it, and she told him. It's another demon. His lips curled, teeth bared in a predatory grin. You're no fairy tale, demon prince. And you will make me truly alive. Naruto was distracted. Temari, in all honesty, was surprised that she had even noticed such a thing. But his eyes were distant, his smiles were small and few, and his tails curled and uncurled in agitation underneath his gold-embroidered blue cloak. He fiddled with her fan, clicking it open and shut in his hands. Hey. He didn't respond, only proving to Temari how distracted he really was. The fan clicked again. She removed herself from her seated position on the grass and sat down on the tree stump directly in front of him. Still, he did not respond. She frowned and placed her hand firmly over the fan he was flicking. Naruto. His head snapped up, eyes suddenly boring into hers. She nearly recoiled. Miss Temari, he said, blinking, I apologize. I am distracted. She finished, lips pressed thinly together. It's very obvious. What's bothering you? He glanced away. Nothing you need to worry about. Temari narrowed her eyes. Tell me anyway. He looked back into her eyes, and she could see the gears working in his mind, debating furiously whether to trust her with this quiet burden or not. Finally, he put his elbows on her knees, using her legs like a table. Just something father told me. Temari kept quiet, instead of pushing him to speak. She removed her hand from its grip on the fan, placing her fingers in his golden locks of hair reassuringly, completely on a whim. The silver circlet glinted red gem set in a cool to the touch. I didn't understand. I don't understand, his expression was odd, but I think that it made Temari-san. Naruto looked up at Temari, sensing the change. Her posture was ridged, teal eyes focused intently on something between the trees. In her eyes was something he had not yet truly witnessed: fear. His hackles rose and he turned to face whatever it was she was looking at. He inhaled deeply and, in one swift movement, stood. Show yourself. He demanded. Gaara solidified out of the shadows like some nameless phantom, his expression hungry. His sand rustled the leaves from the bushes around him, already free from the gourd that contained it. Temari hesitantly, shakily, rose to her feet. Gaara, listen. Her words rose to a sharp shriek as her brother's sand exploded in their direction. She squeezed her eyes shut, covering her head with her hands. However, she never felt sand graze her body, enveloped instead by something soft and warm. She opened her eyes to Naruto's back, one hand and several tails wrapped around her waist protectively. Temari, he spoke softly, go to the lake. Take the flower in my sleeve. Nichi will keep you safe. Understand? She nodded. Honestly, she hadn't the sense of mind to do anything other than what he asked of her. As wary as she was of the demon prince, despite the fact that they could very well be enemies by the time of the Chuunin Exam finals, she feared Gaara much more. The two demonic males started each other down. Naruto growled, a deep rumbling noise from the back of his throat, fangs bared to moonlight. Such offense is redundant here, Sabaku no Gaara. The Redeed's eyes glowed. You are well informed, demon prince of Konohagakure. You have dishonorably come into my territory and attempt to attack me. What have you come here for? Naruto ordered. Gaara tilted his head to one side. Why do you exist? What is your reason for living? You have not earned the right to my answer. You will leave now or I will make you. The Chuunin grinned. Just try. Sand zipped forward once again, golden in color but potent with old blood. Naruto parried the attack with a burst of flame from one tail. Crude glass fell, scorching the earth. The sand slithered back to Gaara's side and the demon prince vanished with it. The Redeed's eyes widened when the prince suddenly appeared in front of him, past his defenses, their faces inches apart. The clawed hand struck the Chuunin in the chest, sending him flying back and gasping for breath. Sand rose up obediently to catch him as he fell. Naruto stood up straight, golden tails whipping around him wildly and watching Gaara with frigid eyes. The other Jinchuriki stood, gasping quietly, eyes glaring fiercely. He threw out a fist and sent a blast of sand toward the prince. The blonde clapped his hands together and the sand split, ripped apart by a blade of wind. You will cease this irrational behavior. Naruto said coldly. He then vanished and reappeared several feet to the right as another blast of sand shot past him. He sped toward the other Jinchuriki, zigzagging as he dodged the Redeed's attacks. He drew his hand back, chakra gathering into his fingertips, and his claws exploded into bright crackling flames. Naruto thrust his claws forward with a cry, fangs bared. The sand caught the prince's hand inches from the Redeed's face, the flames flickering out of existence. Gaara's eyes widened before a cruel smirk curled his lips and sand began crawling up the blonde's legs like a parasite. Naruto narrowed his eyes. His form shimmered momentarily before vanishing completely. The sand went limp in shock. Another attack hit him in the face and he was sent flying once more, 3 slashes gouging out a good portion of his sand armor. He managed to catch himself more quickly this time and kneeled on a platform of sand hovering several feet in the air. Eyes the color of copper rust glared into chilling blue ones. Convinced yet? The blonde demon was answered with a blast of sand, which he effortlessly dodged. Naruto set his eyes firmly on the other boy, exhaling loudly through his nose. He crouched, settling on all fours briefly before leaping into the air. He threw his hand out, claws extended, and 4 blazing blades of wind tore through the sand and Gaara's right leg. The reed dissolved into sand. Naruto's eyes widened in shock and he barely had time to spin around before he was hit. Sand shuriken. He crossed his arms in front of his face as several dozen spinning blades of sand whipped into him, sending the kitsune flying. Shreds of blue and gold material scattered, marred with flecks of blood from wounds that healed almost as quickly as they came. Saliva flew from Naruto's mouth as he flew back and he ended up doing a complete backflip before landing on all fours, skidding back several feet. He wiped away the blood trickling from the corner of his mouth and licked it from the back of his hand, eyeing Gaara with more respect and wariness. The golden fox couldn't deny that he wasn't used to fighting these types of battles. He was far more accustomed to hiding in the foliage and catching the trespasser by surprise, however, that wasn't an option here. Nor was killing the reed. He slammed one tail into the ground. Gaara's eyes widened and he was forced to leap away as the ground split from under him, almost like a miniature earthquake. He landed on a tree branch and cried out, grasping his forehead as he felt his haha stir angrily. He grunted through the pain and sighed heavily when her overbearing presence dissipated, leaving him to his own devices. He panted, arms hanging by his sides. I refuse to continue this battle any further. Naruto stated, lowering his hands. He turned away as his tails ceased their thrashing. Gaara growled furiously. Don't turn your back on me. Naruto spun around as more sand shot toward him and he held out his palm. The sand crashed into a violet barrier, futilely trying to break through. The grains backed off when it became clear that they could not penetrate the barrier. Gaara dropped from the branch and onto the ground, lips curled in a snarl. Naruto eyed his Suna counterpart with something akin to sorrow. How long do you plan on cowering behind your sand, Gaara? He asked quietly. I am not a coward. The reed snarled, sand darting out once more. The demon prince vanished, reappearing beside the reed and nailed his fist into Gaara's ribsage. The tanuki-bearing boy soared away, crashing into open ground. He coughed several times as he pushed himself up, sucking air back into his lungs. Naruto stood up straight, folding his arms. You cannot hide from me. Who's hiding? The other male gasped. You're the one with the cheap disappearing act. An earthen fist emerged from the ground, catching the blonde jaw with a crushing upward thrust. His body soared upward in a slow, graceful arc. For a moment, his mind was elsewhere, sky spinning, all sound mute, eyelids fluttering as his brain restarted. He managed to land lightly, nonetheless fingering his rapidly bruising chin. He took a deep, slow breath to gather his wits about him. Blue eyes snapped open, vertical pupils sharp lines of darkness. He reached Gaara in one bound, forcing the ninja onto his back. It's not easy, is it? The sapphire-eyed demon murmured. It's just as difficult to truly hate as it is to love. Gaara's eyes flashed from within their black prison rings, having the other man off him with a mere thought. What would you know about it? I know a lot more than you think. He bared his teeth. Temari told you. However, Naruto shook his head. Temari didn't have to tell me anything. I know you, because we are the same. I'm not like you. Aren't you? Gaara hesitated then. You thought you were the only one. I can't begin to tell you how wrong you are. You aren't the only one who has suffered, who has been treated as a broken tool, who had been betrayed. Naruto dodged a vicious tentacle of sand. Who broke your heart, Gaara? Shut up. Gaara screeched. Shut up. You think you know everything about me, you don't. You don't know anything, so shut up. Sand exploded toward the blonde demon. And was intercepted by another person entirely. Gaara, please stop. Temari shouted, her arms taking the sharp weighty blow. In that moment, Gaara saw someone other than his sister. Yashimaru, he wheezed, you damn you. I'll kill you. I'll kill you. Yet, even as he ravaged the landscape with furiously spinning sand and soul-tearing screams, the two had already vanished, leaving nothing but a few golden hairs in their wake. So this part ends here. Alright, that's it for today's video guys. Let me know in the comments section how was the story, and also don't forget to like, share and subscribe. I will meet you in another video. Bye bye.